The sun was a merciless hammer, beating down on the cracked earth of the Arizona Territory. Ilara, a girl of 16, felt its heat not just on her skin, but as a suffocating weight on her soul. Her clothes, once a faded shade of blue, were now a shroud of grey dust, clinging to her gaunt frame. Her dark hair was a tangled mess, and her eyes, once bright with childish wonder, were now sunken, holding a grim wisdom far beyond her years. She clutched a small leather pouch, its emptiness a cruel joke against the gnawing hunger in her stomach. Behind her, her two brothers followed, their small, unsteady footsteps kicking up plumes of fine dirt. Finn, 10, was the quieter of the two, his face a mask of silent endurance. His younger brother Leo, just 5, whimpered softly, his small hand wrapped tightly around Ilara's frayed skirt. He didn't understand the silence, the constant walking, or the reason their stomachs ached. All he knew was the comfort of his sister's presence. "Are we almost there, Ilara?" Leo's voice was a frail whisper. Ilara didn't turn. She couldn't. The sight of their suffering was a blade in her gut. "Almost, Leo. Just a little further, I promise." The lie tasted like ash. They had been walking for 3 days since their father's fever had claimed him, and their mother, broken by grief and hunger, had followed him 2 days later. The world had shrunk to a single, desperate mission: find food. They were a ghost family, moving through a land that had swallowed up everything they once had. Their small, dusty wagon lay abandoned miles back, its wheels broken, a monument to their broken life. Now they were on foot, their possessions reduced to what little they could carry. The leather pouch held a few coins, but they were in the middle of nowhere. A few days ago, they'd passed a small homestead, but the owners had turned them away, their own faces etched with the fear of scarcity. Ilara knew their time was running out. She saw the light dimming in Finn's eyes and the desperate pleas in Leo's. She had to act. She had heard whispers of a large ranch, a place called the Hayes Ranch, miles ahead. It was a long shot, a gamble born of desperation. The owner was rumored to be a hard man, a widower who kept to himself. But he was also said to be wealthy, with barns full of grain and corrals full of cattle. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in fiery oranges and deep purples, Ilara saw it. A cluster of buildings huddled in a valley below, surrounded by sprawling fields and fences that stretched to the horizon. The sight filled her with a fierce, burning hope, but also a cold dread. What if they were like the others? What if they turned her away? She led her brothers down the rocky slope, the last dregs of their energy spent on the descent. The air grew cooler, carrying the scent of cut hay and livestock. Her stomach growled, a loud, embarrassing protest. She pushed the hunger aside, focusing on the task at hand. She had a plan, a terrible plan, but it was the only one she had. They reached the edge of the ranch property as dusk settled, turning the world into a landscape of deep shadows. The main house was a sturdy log cabin, its windows glowing with a soft, warm light. It looked like a haven, a world away from their reality, a world she was about to trespass on. "Finn, stay with Leo here," she whispered, pulling them into the shadows of a large oak tree. "Don't make a sound. Wait for me." Finn's hand closed around her arm. "Ilara, what are you doing?" His voice was low, filled with a maturity no 10-year-old should possess. "I'm getting us food," she said, her voice firm. She couldn't tell him the truth, not yet. He would try to stop her. "But, no buts. I'll be back. I promise." She looked into his eyes, trying to convey a resolve she wasn't sure she felt. He nodded, his face grim. She knelt and hugged Leo, whose small body trembled with a chill that wasn't from the evening air. "I love you, Leo. I'll be right back." With her heart pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs, Ilara crept towards the large barn. The air was thick with the smells of horse and hay and the distant lowing of cattle. A sliver of moonlight illuminated the barn doors, ajar just enough to slip through. She slid inside, her movements silent, every muscle tense. The barn was a vast cavern of shadows and shapes. Sacks of feed were stacked high against one wall, their scent filling the air with the promise of sustenance. She moved with practiced stealth, her years of living on the edge of survival making her a ghost in the dark. She found a small, discarded sack and began to fill it with grain, her hands shaking with a mixture of fear and adrenaline. As she worked, a sound broke the silence, a soft, rhythmic crunching. She froze, her breath caught in her throat. The sound was coming from the other side of the barn, near the stalls. A horse. She relaxed slightly, just an animal, but then a different sound, a cough, a human cough. Her heart leaped into her throat. She dropped the sack, its contents spilling onto the dirt floor. Panic, cold and sharp, seized her. She had to get out, now. She scrambled towards the open door, but it was too late. A tall, broad figure stepped into the doorway, his silhouette blocking out the moonlight, his voice a low rumble cut through the night. "Hold it right there!" Ilara froze. She was trapped. Her eyes darted around the barn, searching for an escape, but there was none. She was caught, a starving mouse in a cat's lair. She could feel the man's eyes on her, even in the dim light, and the weight of his judgment was a physical thing. He took a step closer, his boots crunching on the hay-strewn floor. She could make out the lines of his face now, etched with years of sun and hard work. He wore a simple rancher's shirt and trousers, and a wide-brimmed hat shadowed his face. He was an imposing man, his presence filling the space. "What's a child doing sneaking around in my barn at this hour?" he asked, his voice without threat, but with an underlying authority that made her tremble. Ilara said nothing. She couldn't. Her throat was tight with fear. "I asked you a question," he repeated, his tone firming slightly. She finally found her voice, a broken, raspy sound. I needed to feed my brothers." The words were a torrent, a dam breaking. "We haven't eaten in days. They're so hungry." "Please, sir, we just needed some food." The man paused, his stance softening. He looked down at the spilled grain, then back at her. His gaze was steady, and for a moment, Ilara saw something she hadn't expected to see. Not anger, but a flicker of something she couldn't name. Pity. "Your brothers?" he asked, his voice softer now. Ilara nodded, tears welling up in her eyes, hot and salty against her dusty cheeks. "They're hiding by the big oak tree. I was just trying to get some food for them. Please don't take them away. Please, sir, I'll work. I'll do anything. Just please don't take my brothers." The last words were a plea torn from the deepest part of her soul, a primal cry of a child fighting to protect her family. The world was her enemy, and she was begging her captor for mercy. Her voice, thin but filled with the desperation of a starving animal, echoed in the quiet barn, a stark contrast to the man's composed silence. His expression, previously unreadable, shifted. The flicker of something she'd seen before now solidified into a deep-seated sadness. He saw not a thief, but a girl on the brink of collapse, haunted by a fear so profound it was almost tangible. The weight of her words hung in the air, a testament to a loss and a burden he knew all too well. The cry hung in the air, a raw, desperate sound that stripped away the silence of the night. For a long, agonizing moment, Samuel "Sam" Hayes just stood there, his mind reeling. He had seen his share of hardship in his 50 years. He'd ridden with cattle drives, faced down outlaws, and buried his wife Sarah and their unborn child 2 years prior. He thought he knew the depths of human despair, but the sight of this girl, a child really, broken and pleading, was something new. Something that struck a chord he thought had been silenced forever. The words, "Please don't take my brothers," were a hammer blow to his heart. They brought back a rush of painful memories of another time, another place, when he had stood by helplessly as a different kind of life was taken from him. He remembered his wife's gentle face, her swollen belly, the promise of a future that had vanished in a cloud of dust and grief. He had built a wall around his heart then, a wall of silence and solitude, believing it was the only way to survive the crushing weight of sorrow. But now, looking at this trembling girl, her eyes wide with a terror he recognized as his own. His carefully constructed wall began to crumble. He saw not a thief, but a mirror of his own past pain. He saw a child forced to carry the burdens of an adult, a girl who had to be the mother, father, and provider, all while she herself was starving. The reality of her situation, the sheer, bone-deep hunger written on her face, froze the blood in his veins. He felt a profound, terrible ache, a mix of pity and a shared sense of loss. He took a slow step forward, his boot scuffing the dirt. The girl flinched, pulling her arms tighter around herself. "I'm not the law," he said, his voice a low, steady baritone, devoid of any threat. "I'm not here to take anyone." Ilara's eyes, full of unshed tears, flickered with a hesitant question. She didn't trust his words, and why should she? The world had given her little reason to. "Show me," he said, gesturing towards the barn door. "Show me your brothers." Hesitation warred with desperation on her face. What if this was a trick? What if he was just trying to lure them all out? But the look in his eyes, the deep-set lines of a man who had known sorrow, gave her a sliver of hope. It was a risk, but staying here was a death sentence for her and her brothers. She finally nodded, a barely perceptible movement. She slipped past him, her small frame a fleeting shadow in the moonlight, and darted back towards the oak tree. Sam followed at a respectful distance, his eyes scanning the darkness, a hand resting on the colt at his hip, a gesture of instinct more than intent. They found Finn and Leo huddled together, a tiny bundle of misery in the shadows. Finn's head snapped up when he saw his sister, his face a mix of fear and relief. Leo, shivering uncontrollably, clung to his older brother, his thumb in his mouth. Ilara knelt, wrapping her arms around them. "It's all right," she whispered, her voice trembling. "It's all right. I'm here." Sam stepped into the moonlight, his shadow falling over the small family. Finn's eyes went wide with alarm, and he instinctively pushed Leo behind him, a valiant, if futile, gesture of protection. "They haven't eaten in days," Ilara said, her voice cracking. "Please, sir, just some bread." "A little milk." Sam didn't answer right away. He just stared at the three of them, a tableau of heartbreaking poverty. The silence was heavy, punctuated only by the rustle of leaves and the distant lowing of a cow. He looked at Finn, the brave little boy trying to be a man, and then at Leo, a child so young he barely understood the world's cruelty. He saw the same fierce, protective love in Ilara's eyes that he had seen in his own heart when he had lost everything. He thought of his empty house, the dust motes dancing in the silent rooms, the echoes of a life that was supposed to be filled with laughter and children. He thought of his dusty dinner table set for one, a constant reminder of what was gone. "Get up," he said finally, his voice gruff. "All of you, come with me." Ilara's breath hitched. To the sheriff?" Sam shook his head. "To the house. You're not going to be able to eat out of a sack on the road, not tonight. Besides, a plate of stew is better than dry grain." Relief, so potent and overwhelming it almost made her dizzy, washed over Ilara. She scrambled to her feet, pulling her brothers up with her. She didn't know this man's game, didn't know if this was a trap, but the offer of stew was a siren's call she couldn't ignore. He led them back towards the ranch house, his lantern casting long, dancing shadows. As they walked, Ilara could hear her brothers' small stomachs rumbling, their hunger a physical presence in the night. The warmth of the cabin's light grew stronger with every step, a beacon in the darkness. Inside, the house was sparse but clean. A large stone fireplace cast a warm glow over the main room. A table and a few chairs were the only furniture, besides a worn leather armchair by the fire. The scent of pine and old leather filled the air. Sam gestured to the chairs. "Sit down. I'll get you some water." He went to the well pump by the back door, and Ilara watched him, her eyes wide with disbelief. He wasn't a monster. He wasn't a thief. He was a man. Just a man. He returned with a bucket of fresh water and a ladle. Ilara drank greedily, the cool liquid a shock to her parched throat. She gave some to Finn and Leo, who drank with the same desperate urgency. "I'll make some stew," he said, heading to the kitchen. He worked with a quiet efficiency, his movements practiced and deliberate. Ilara watched him, a knot of tension still tight in her stomach. What was his motive? Why was he being kind? As the stew bubbled on the stove, its rich, savory smell filled the air, a scent so intoxicating it made Ilara feel faint. She watched her brothers, their eyes fixed on the pot, their faces a mix of awe and anticipation. This was the first real food they had seen in days. When he finally ladled the stew into 3 wooden bowls and set them on the table, it was a moment of profound grace. Ilara looked at the hearty stew, the chunks of meat and vegetables floating in a rich broth, and a single tear escaped her eye, tracing a clean line down her dusty cheek. She ate slowly at first, savoring every spoonful, the flavors a revelation. Soon her pace quickened, as if she were afraid the food would vanish before her eyes. Sam watched them eat, his expression unreadable. He had seen hunger before, but never so raw, so pure. It was a hunger that humbled and shamed, a hunger that spoke of a failure of the world. He said nothing, just leaned against the stone fireplace, his arms crossed, his gaze fixed on the 3 children who had, in a single night, broken through his defenses and forced him to confront the ghost of his own pain. The first light of dawn was a soft, pale wash across the plains, but inside the Hayes Ranch house, a different kind of light was dawning. Ilara, Finn and Leo, their stomachs full for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, were asleep on the floor near the warm fireplace, wrapped in thick blankets Sam had provided. Sam sat in his armchair, a cup of black coffee in his hands, watching them. He hadn't slept. His mind was a maelstrom of thoughts and feelings he had long since buried. He was a man of routine and solitude. His days were a predictable cycle of tending to his cattle, mending fences, and eating his meals alone. This sudden intrusion was an earthquake in his quiet life. He had taken them in on impulse, a reaction to a desperate plea, but now what? He couldn't just send them back out into the wilderness. They wouldn't survive. They were too young, too fragile. But keeping them, that was a different matter. He didn't know how to deal with children. His life with Sarah had been cut short before they could even begin to build a family. The only child he had ever truly known was a memory, a phantom pain that lingered in the quiet corners of his home. He put down his coffee and walked to the window, watching the sun climb higher, turning the sky a brilliant shade of gold. His ranch, with its sturdy barns and well-fed cattle, was a testament to his hard work and resilience. But it was also a monument to his isolation. He had built this life to protect himself, to keep the world and its sorrows at bay, and now 3 children had breached his walls without so much as a knock. A sudden noise made him turn. Ilara was awake, sitting up and looking around with wide, confused eyes. She saw him, and her face, still soft with sleep, hardened with a defensive wariness. "Good morning," Sam said, his voice flat. Ilara said nothing. She looked at her brothers, who were still soundly sleeping, and a flicker of relief crossed her face. "Your brothers are safe," Sam said, anticipating her unspoken question. "No one's going to hurt them here." Ilara finally spoke, her voice still raspy. "Why are you doing this?" He shrugged, a small, weary gesture. "You were hungry. I had food. You could have just given us some," she said, her eyes boring into his. "You didn't have to bring us in." Sam sighed, running a hand over his face. "Maybe not, but I've seen what happens to children on their own out here. It's not a good life." She bristled, her pride wounded. "We would have been fine." "Would you?" he challenged, his voice sharp with a sudden flash of frustration. "You were stealing from my barn, child. Stealing. If I hadn't found you, someone else might have, and they wouldn't have been as forgiving." The truth of his words was a bitter pill. She looked away, her eyes fixed on the fire. He was right. She had been desperate, and desperation was a dangerous thing in this land. "I'll work," she said, her voice low but firm. "I'll work for our keep. I can cook, I can clean, I'm strong." Sam looked at her thin arms, her fragile frame, and a humorless smile touched his lips. "You're strong, I can see that, but you're not a ranch hand." "I'll do whatever you need," she insisted, her gaze unwavering. "Please, just let us stay, just for a little while, until we can get back on our feet." The word please was a raw-edged plea, a sign of her desperation. It was a plea he had heard before, in a different voice, in a different life. He remembered Sarah, her last words a whispered request for him to hold her hand. He looked at the 3 children, huddled together on his floor, a fragile little family in a world that had tried to tear them apart. He thought of his quiet, empty nights, the silence that pressed in on him. This was not what he had planned. It was not what he wanted, but he couldn't bring himself to turn them away. "All right," he said, the word a reluctant agreement. "You can stay, but you'll work. You'll earn your keep. No charity." Ilara's face brightened with a mixture of relief and defiance. "Thank you, sir. We won't be a burden." He grunted in response. He knew they would be. They would be a disruption to his routine, a constant reminder of his own empty life. But he also knew he couldn't live with himself if he sent them back out into the harsh world. "Breakfast first," he said, turning towards the stove. "Then we'll talk about what you can do." As he cooked, Ilara woke her brothers, who rubbed the sleep from their eyes and looked at their surroundings with a mixture of fear and wonder. The house was so different from the rough-hewn shacks and tents they were used to. It smelled of food and warmth. Breakfast was a simple affair, thick slabs of bacon, cornbread, and more coffee for Sam. They ate in silence, the only sound the clatter of forks on plates. Ilara kept her eyes on her brothers, making sure they ate every bite. When Leo dropped a piece of cornbread, she quickly picked it up and gave it to him, a silent command in her eyes. After they finished, Sam laid out the terms. "You'll help in the kitchen. Keep the house clean. You'll help me with the laundry and the mending. Your brothers, they can help with the chickens maybe, simple chores. But you have to earn your food, your blankets, your keep. We'll be clear on this. This isn't a handout." His words were firm, but Ilara heard the underlying message. It was a deal, an uneasy alliance. He was offering them a chance, not a charity, and that was something she could accept. Her pride, her fierce independence, was what had kept her and her brothers alive so far. She wasn't about to give that up, even for a roof over their heads. "Understood," she said, her voice clear and strong. He gave her a nod, a silent acknowledgement of their new, fragile arrangement. The sun was now fully up, casting its bright, unforgiving light on the world outside. The ranch was stirring to life, the sounds of men and animals beginning their daily rhythm. Sam knew he would have to face his foreman, Jedediah, and the other hands. This was a place for tough men, not for a girl and her 2 young brothers. The questions would come, the doubts and the ridicule, but for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than emptiness. He felt the stirrings of a new kind of duty, a responsibility he hadn't sought but couldn't turn away from. The heart that had frozen in grief was beginning to thaw, a slow, painful process in the cold light of a new day. The arrival of Ilara, Finn, and Leo at the Hayes Ranch was met with a mixture of curiosity and thinly veiled contempt. The ranch hands, a rugged and unsentimental lot, saw them as an inconvenience, a drain on resources. But no one's disapproval was as sharp and cutting as that of Jedediah, the ranch foreman. Jedediah was a man carved from the same unforgiving landscape as the ranch itself. Hard-faced, with a thick beard and eyes the color of a stormy sky, he had been with Sam for 20 years. He was fiercely loyal, a man who saw the world in black and white, and he saw Ilara and her brothers as a problem, a weakness. They were a liability, and a man like Sam Hayes, a man who had built an empire from nothing, couldn't afford a weakness. On their first morning, Sam took Ilara and her brothers out to the main barn to introduce them to the crew. The hands were gathered, preparing for the day's work. They stopped what they were doing and watched as Sam approached, the 3 children trailing behind him like small, frightened ducklings. "This here is Ilara, Finn, and Leo," Sam said, his voice carrying an unspoken warning. "They'll be helping out around the house." Jedediah stepped forward, his eyes fixed on Ilara. He didn't bother to hide his disdain. "Helping out with what, Sam? The women's work? We don't have women here, not since—" He let the thought trail off, a deliberate and cruel reference to Sarah. Ilara flinched, but she stood her ground, her small shoulders squared. She met his gaze, her eyes fierce. She wasn't a charity case, and she wasn't about to let him treat her like one. Sam's jaw tightened. "That's enough, Jedediah. They're here to stay. End of discussion." The other men shuffled their feet uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. They knew Jedediah's temperament, and they knew not to cross him. Jedediah, however, was not finished. He took a step closer to Ilara, his voice a low growl. "This is a working ranch, girl. We don't have time for messes, and we don't have extra mouths to feed." "We'll earn our keep," Ilara said, her voice surprisingly steady. "We'll work hard." Jedediah let out a short, derisive laugh. You're barely a wisp of a thing. What can you do? Carry water buckets? Feed the chickens?" "A 5-year-old could do that." He gestured to Leo, who was clinging to Ilara's leg, his face buried in her skirt. Ilara's face burned with a mixture of humiliation and anger. She had to fight for her brothers. She had to show them she was worthy of a place here. Sam stepped between them, his posture rigid. "I said that's enough, Jedediah. Get back to work." The foreman gave Sam a long, hard look, a silent challenge passing between them. Sam held his gaze, his face a mask of cold resolve. Finally, Jedediah's eyes dropped. He grunted and turned away, stomping towards his horse. The other men followed suit, their quiet disapproval a tangible presence in the air. As the day progressed, Ilara was given her first tasks. Sam, true to his word, had her start with the simple chores. She washed the dishes, scrubbed the floors, and helped him mend a few shirts. She worked with a fierce determination, her movements precise and quick. She wanted to prove him wrong, to prove all of them wrong. But as she worked, she could feel the weight of their scrutiny. Every time she looked up, she saw Jedediah watching her from the corner of his eye, his face a permanent scowl. At lunchtime, the hands ate together outside the bunkhouse, a boisterous group. Ilara and her brothers ate with Sam on the porch of the main house, a silent, separate family. The sounds of laughter and conversation from the other men were a stark reminder of their isolation. "Don't mind Jedediah," Sam said, his voice low. "He's a good man, but he's set in his ways." "He hates us," Ilara said simply, her eyes fixed on the foreman's back. "He doesn't know you," Sam corrected. "He doesn't understand. He just sees a complication, but he's loyal. You can count on that." Ilara wasn't so sure. She had seen the raw hatred in Jedediah's eyes, and she knew it was more than just suspicion. It was a personal attack, a challenge to her very existence on this ranch. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that he would do everything in his power to make their lives miserable. That afternoon, Jedediah found her attempting to hang a heavy load of laundry on a clothesline. The wind had picked up, and the wet sheets were a cumbersome, slippery burden. She struggled to lift the basket, her arms aching from the effort. Jedediah watched from a distance, a smirk playing on his lips. "Need some help, little lady?" he called out, his voice laced with sarcasm. Ilara ignored him, her face flushed with effort. She hoisted the basket, her muscles screaming in protest. As she lifted it, a gust of wind caught the sheets, sending them flying and knocking her off balance. She stumbled, and the basket went tumbling, spilling the wet laundry onto the dusty ground. A wave of humiliation washed over her. She stood there, frozen, the hot tears of frustration blurring her vision. Jedediah walked over, his face a mask of false sympathy. "I told you, this ain't a place for you. You should be in an orphanage where you belong." "I belong with my brothers," she said, her voice shaking. She bent down, her hands fumbling to gather the now dirty laundry. He kicked a small pile of sheets with the toe of his boot, sending them flying. "You think you can just waltz in here and take up space? This ranch is for people who can work, not for strays." "Jedediah!" a voice thundered from behind them. Sam stood in the doorway of the main barn, his face grim. The air crackled with a silent tension. Jedediah froze, his smug expression replaced with a look of defiance. "She's having trouble with the laundry, Sam," Jedediah said, his voice now a smooth lie. "Just trying to offer a hand." "Leave her be," Sam said, his eyes hard. "Get back to work, now." Jedediah stared at him for a moment, then turned and walked away, his shoulders stiff with a simmering resentment. Sam walked over to Ilara, who was on her knees, desperately trying to salvage the laundry. He didn't say anything, just knelt down beside her and began to help her fold the sheets. His hands, calloused and rough from years of ranch work, were surprisingly gentle. The silent act of kindness, in stark contrast to Jedediah's cruelty, was a balm on her wounded pride. As they worked, Sam spoke, his voice low and steady. "Don't let him get to you. He's a tough nut, but he's been with me a long time. He'll come around." Ilara said nothing, but a fresh wave of tears stung her eyes. It wasn't just the laundry. It was the injustice, the endless battle to prove herself. But as she folded the last sheet and placed it in the basket, she felt a flicker of something new, a small, fragile sense of belonging. She had an ally, an unexpected one, and that was more than she had had in a very long time. Life on the Hayes Ranch settled into a rhythm, one that was harsh but predictable. Ilara and her brothers became a quiet fixture, their presence a constant low-level irritation to Jedediah and a source of quiet fascination for the other ranch hands. Ilara, true to her word, worked from sunup to sundown. She learned to mend torn clothes with a deft hand, to churn butter, and to bake bread that filled the small house with a comforting aroma. Sam, for his part, taught her how to milk the one dairy cow he kept, a gentle old animal named Daisy. He was a patient, if a quiet, teacher, his instructions concise and to the point. One afternoon, as she was helping him mend a fence, Sam watched her work, his eyes thoughtful. She was surprisingly strong for her size, her small hands calloused from the unaccustomed labor. "You're a good worker, Ilara," he said, breaking the silence. She looked up, startled. A compliment from Sam was a rare thing. "I told you I would be." He nodded, a hint of a smile on his lips. "You did, but not everyone keeps their word." "We've had to for a long time," she said, looking out at the endless expanse of rolling hills. There was no one else to rely on. He fell silent, and Ilara knew she had touched on a topic that was too personal, too painful for him to discuss. Their relationship was built on a foundation of silence and shared work, a fragile truce between two people who had both suffered great loss. While Ilara worked, Finn and Leo were given simple chores of their own. Finn, a natural with animals, was put in charge of feeding the chickens and gathering eggs. He took to the task with a serious focus, his face lighting up when the chickens pecked at the grain he scattered. Leo, still too young for much, was happy to follow Finn around, his small face bright with awe. They were slowly coming back to life, their hollowed cheeks filling out, the light returning to their eyes. But the ranch was still a dangerous place, and Jedediah was a constant reminder of that danger. He found new ways to test Ilara, to push her to her limits. He would leave heavy buckets of water for her to carry, or accidentally knock over her laundry basket, a cruel smile on his face as he watched her struggle. She never reacted, never complained. She would just pick up the pieces and start over, her quiet resilience a silent act of defiance. One day, while Ilara was washing clothes in a large metal tub, Jedediah approached her, a sinister glint in his eye. He held a large rusty gear in his hand, a heavy piece of equipment from the windmill. "Here, girl," he said, his voice a low sneer. "Sam wants this cleaned. Says it's a big job." Ilara looked at the gear, covered in grease and rust. It was a chore meant to take hours, a punishment designed to break her spirit. She took it from him without a word, her face unreadable. Jedediah watched her, waiting for a reaction. When none came, he let out a frustrated sigh and walked away, muttering to himself. Ilara knelt by the tub, a sense of despair settling over her. She scrubbed at the gear with a coarse brush, but the rust was stubborn. Her fingers were raw and bleeding, the grime embedded under her nails. She felt the tears welling up, but she blinked them back. She wouldn't let him win. A shadow fell over her, and she looked up to see Sam standing there, his face grim. He looked from her bleeding hands to the grimy gear. "Jedediah give you this?" he asked, his voice dangerously quiet. Ilara nodded, her eyes fixed on the rust. Sam knelt down, taking the brush from her hand. He examined the gear, then threw it down with a disgusted clatter. "That's a job for an oil rag, not a scrub brush," he said, his voice a low rumble. "He knows that." He stood up, his eyes now blazing with a cold anger. He walked towards the bunkhouse, his stride long and purposeful. Ilara, her heart pounding, watched him go. She knew what was coming. Sam found Jedediah by the horse corrals. A few of the other hands gathered around him. "Jedediah!" Sam's voice cut through the air, sharp as a whip. The foreman turned, a look of smug satisfaction on his face. "Yes, Sam?" "The gear," Sam said, his voice low and tight. "You gave her the gear to clean, a job you knew would tear up her hands." Jedediah shrugged, feigning ignorance. "It was a chore that needed doing, boss. The girl said she could do anything." The other men shifted uncomfortably, avoiding eye contact. They knew this was a line that was about to be crossed. "That's a lie, and you know it," Sam said, his voice now a dangerous growl. "You're trying to run them off. You think I don't see it?" Jedediah's face hardened. "They're a mistake, Sam. They don't belong here. They're a reminder of what you lost. A constant—" He didn't get to finish the sentence. Sam's fist connected with his jaw in a sudden, brutal punch that sent Jedediah stumbling backward, a look of shock on his face. He hit the dirt with a grunt, a thin stream of blood running from his lip. The other men froze, their eyes wide. A fight between Sam and Jedediah was unheard of. They were more than a boss and a foreman. They were the foundation of the ranch. Jedediah scrambled to his feet, a wild look in his eyes. He lunged at Sam, but Sam, faster and with a cold precision, sidestepped and landed another punch, this one to the foreman's gut. Jedediah doubled over, gasping for air. "They are not a mistake, Jedediah," Sam said, his voice flat and cold. "They're what I choose, and if you have a problem with that, you can pack your bags and ride on." Jedediah looked up at him, his face a mask of shock and disbelief. He had known Sam for 2 decades, had fought beside him, built this ranch with him. He had never seen this side of him before, this fierce, protective rage. He finally nodded, a silent admission of defeat. He wiped the blood from his lip and walked away, his pride wounded, his respect for Sam now a mix of fear and confusion. Sam walked back to Ilara, who was watching him with wide, frightened eyes. He picked up the gear, grabbed an oil rag, and cleaned it in a few quick wipes. He then knelt down and looked at her bleeding hands. "Get some water and clean those," he said, his voice gentler now. "He won't bother you again." Ilara looked at him, a tear finally escaping her eye. She had fought for her brothers for so long, alone. But in that moment, she realized she wasn't alone anymore. She had an unlikely protector, a man who had fought for her, a man whose frozen heart was beginning to show signs of life. And in the harsh, cruel world of the West, that was a miracle in itself. After the confrontation with Jedediah, a fragile peace settled over the Hayes Ranch. Jedediah, though still sullen and resentful, kept his distance from Ilara and her brothers. He would cast them dark looks from a distance, but he never again spoke a cruel word or interfered with their work. The other ranch hands, having witnessed the fight, now treated the children with a newfound respect, a mix of awe and trepidation. They saw that Sam Hayes, the man they thought they knew, was not as cold and unfeeling as he had appeared. This new sense of security allowed Ilara to breathe for the first time in months. The constant gnawing fear was replaced with a quiet sense of hope. Her days were still filled with work, but the labor no longer felt like a constant battle for survival. It was a building, a foundation for a new life. She began to see the ranch not as a temporary refuge, but as a home. She learned the lay of the land, the rhythm of the seasons. She learned which cow was stubborn, which chicken was a good layer, and which chores were best done in the early morning light. She found a quiet satisfaction in her work, in the simple, repetitive tasks that provided for her and her brothers. Sam, too, began to change. The silence in his home was replaced with the soft sounds of children's laughter. He would often find Finn and Leo playing in the yard, their faces smudged with dirt, their small bodies filled with the boundless energy of children who were no longer starving. He would stand at the window, a cup of coffee in his hand, and just watch them, a small, almost imperceptible smile touching his lips. He started eating his meals at the table with them, the silence broken by the chatter of Finn and Leo. They would tell him about their day, about a frog they had found by the creek, or a bird's nest they had discovered. Ilara would sit quietly, listening to their voices, her heart full with a gratitude that was too deep for words. One evening, as the sun was setting in a blaze of red and gold, Sam found Ilara sitting on the porch steps, a worn book in her lap. She was reading aloud to Finn and Leo, her voice soft and melodic. It was a collection of children's stories their mother had read to them, and they had managed to save it from the wreckage of their old life. Sam sat down beside her, his presence a quiet comfort. "What are you reading?" he asked. Ilara looked up, startled. She hadn't heard him approach. "Just a book our ma used to read to us," she said, her voice a little shy. "Stories about knights and dragons." He nodded, listening as she continued to read. Her voice, so firm and resolute when she was speaking to him, was filled with a tender warmth when she read to her brothers. He watched her, the last light of the sun illuminating her face, and he saw a different girl than the one who had pleaded with him in the dark barn. He saw a girl who was a mother, a protector, a storyteller. When she finished the story, Leo, who had fallen asleep with his head in her lap, stirred. Ilara picked him up, her movements practiced and gentle. "I'll put them to bed," she said. "Wait," Sam said, his voice a little rough. "That was a good story." Ilara's face was a mixture of surprise and pleasure. "Thank you, sir." He cleared his throat, a little embarrassed. "I was just thinking, maybe we should find you some more books, something with more words." Ilara's eyes widened. "Really?" He nodded. "There's a small town a day's ride from here. I can get you some when I go for supplies." A flicker of genuine happiness, a happiness she hadn't felt in a very long time, crossed her face. That would be wonderful. Thank you, sir." That small moment, the simple offer of books, was a turning point. It was no longer a matter of work for food. It was a sign that he saw her not just as a pair of hands, but as a person, with a mind and a heart that needed more than just sustenance to thrive. It was a sign that he was beginning to see her brothers not as a burden, but as children who deserved a life beyond mere survival. The next few weeks were a testament to this change. Sam began to talk more, to tell them stories of his life, of the cattle drives and the wild, untamed land. He would teach Ilara how to tend to the vegetable garden, showing her which plants needed the most sun and which ones needed the most water. He even taught Finn how to throw a lasso, his hands guiding the boy's small fingers, a patience in his movements that he never showed to anyone else. One day, while Ilara was helping him repair a broken wagon wheel, she found the courage to ask a question that had been on her mind for weeks. "Mr. Hayes, Jedediah told me you had a wife and a child." Sam stopped what he was doing, the silence stretching between them. His face, usually a stoic mask, was now a portrait of pain. "Her name was Sarah," he said, his voice low and heavy. "She was due to have our baby. A boy, we thought. There were complications. We lost them both." Ilara's heart ached for him. She saw now why he was so closed off, so isolated. His grief was a wound that had never healed. "I'm so sorry," she whispered. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on a distant point on the horizon. The ranch was supposed to be for them, a place to raise a family. When they were gone, it just became a place to work, a place to forget. His words, simple and direct, were a profound admission. It was the first time he had spoken of his pain to anyone, and the weight of his sorrow was a palpable thing. Ilara didn't know what to say. There were no words for a loss like that. She just reached out and with a tentative hand placed it on his arm, a small, silent gesture of empathy. He didn't flinch. He just looked at her hand on his arm, and for a moment the chasm of grief and solitude between them seemed to shrink, replaced by a quiet understanding, the silent promise of a shared future, fragile and uncertain, but a promise nonetheless, a glimmer of hope in a land that had known only despair. As the weeks turned into months, the Hayes Ranch slowly transformed. It was no longer just a place of hard labor and quiet sorrow. It was a home. The smells of Ilara's baking replaced the scent of dust and leather in the house. The sounds of Finn and Leo's laughter echoed off the walls. Sam found himself adapting to a new routine, one that included reading bedtime stories and teaching a small boy how to whittle a piece of wood. But not all was peaceful. The seasons were changing, and with the change came new challenges. A long, dry spell was gripping the territory, and the water in the creek that fed the ranch was starting to dwindle. The cattle were restless, their lowing a constant, anxious chorus. Sam was spending more time than usual out on the range. A deep worry etched on his face. Jedediah, ever the pessimist, grumbled about the coming drought, his grim predictions a constant source of tension. "We're gonna lose the herd, Sam," he said one afternoon, his voice heavy with foreboding. "No rain, no grass. We're gonna have to sell a third of the cattle." Sam shook his head. "Not yet. We'll drive them to the north pasture. The creek there runs deeper." Jedediah scoffed. "Takes a full day's ride. We'll lose a lot of them on the way." Ilara, who was passing by, heard their conversation. She knew what this meant. If they lost a significant portion of the herd, their livelihood, their home, would be in jeopardy. That night, she found Sam poring over maps by the light of a lantern, a look of profound weariness on his face. He didn't seem to notice her at first, his brow furrowed in concentration. "Is it bad, Mr. Hayes?" she asked, her voice soft. He looked up, surprised. "It's manageable. We'll get them to the north pasture." "Jedediah doesn't think so," she said, her voice a little skeptical. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "Jedediah's a good foreman, but he sees the worst in every situation. He's right, it'll be a hard ride, but it's a risk we have to take." Ilara's mind raced. She knew the land around the ranch better now, from her long walks with her brothers and her quiet observations. She had seen a small spring, miles away, hidden in a rocky outcrop. It was a trickle, not enough to water a herd, but enough to offer a brief respite. She also knew that it was located in a narrow canyon, a shortcut that could save them hours of riding in the blistering heat. "There's a spring," she said, her voice hesitant, "hidden in a canyon near the old Indian burial ground. It's a shortcut." Sam looked at her, his expression a mixture of surprise and disbelief. "A spring? Where?" "I've been on this land for 20 years, and I've never seen a spring there." "It's small," she explained. "It's in a little crevice in the rocks. I found it while I was looking for sagebrush." He looked at her, then back at the map. The old Indian burial ground was marked on the map, a patch of land he had always avoided, a place of silent reverence. He didn't believe her, not really. But the desperation in his eyes, the need for a solution, made him consider it. "Show me," he said, getting to his feet. The next morning, before the sun had fully risen, Sam and Ilara rode out, their horses kicking up dust in the morning light. He had told Jedediah he was scouting a new trail, but he had kept the true purpose of their ride to himself. The idea of taking advice from a 16-year-old girl was not something he wanted to share with his foreman. Ilara led him on a winding path, through sun-scorched hills and past thorny bushes. Sam, ever the skeptic, was half convinced she was just a child making up stories. But then, as they reached the canyon, she dismounted and led him through a narrow crevice in the rocks. There, hidden from the open plains, was a small, shaded pool of water, fed by a barely perceptible trickle from a crack in the stone. It was a miracle. Sam knelt down, touching the cool water. It was barely enough to fill a canteen, but it was proof that Ilara had been right. It was a secret of the land that she had uncovered, a secret that had been there all along, hidden in plain sight. He looked at her, a new kind of respect in his eyes. "How did you find this?" I notice things," she said, her cheeks flushing with pride. "When you're alone, you have to." He nodded, understanding. When you have nothing, you have to pay attention to everything. This little spring, this shortcut, was a gift from a child who had learned the hard way how to survive. It was also a sign that she was beginning to see the ranch not as his, but as theirs, a place that they were helping to build and sustain. When they returned to the ranch, Sam gathered the men. Jedediah watched from the side, his face a mask of suspicion. "We're going to move the herd to the north pasture," Sam announced, "but we'll take a different route, a shorter one." Jedediah bristled. "What are you talking about, Sam? There's no shortcut that goes through there." "There is now," Sam said, looking directly at Ilara. "Ilara found it. It's a new trail, one that will save us a full day of riding and a lot of cattle." Jedediah's face went white with anger. The idea that this girl, this child he so despised, had found something he had missed for 20 years was an unbearable insult. The other men looked at Ilara with a new kind of interest, a glimmer of respect in their eyes. That night, as the men prepared for the long cattle drive, Sam sat on the porch with Ilara. The air was cool, the sky a vast canvas of stars. "That was a good thing you did today, Ilara," he said, his voice soft. "You saved us." "I just want to help," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "This is our home now. We have to protect it." He looked at her, at the fierce determination in her young face. He had seen that same determination in the eyes of his wife, a woman who had fought to build a life with him in this harsh land. Ilara was not a child anymore. She was a partner in this fragile new family they were building. The road ahead was long and difficult, but with her help, he felt for the first time that they might just make it. The quiet hope that had settled in his heart was no longer a flicker, but a steady flame, a promise of a future he had once thought was lost forever. The cattle drive began at the crack of dawn, the air filled with the lowing of the herd and the shouts of the ranch hands. Ilara watched from the porch, her stomach a tight knot of anxiety. The long line of cattle stretched out across the plains, a moving river of brown and black. The sun, already a hot disk in the sky, promised a brutal day ahead. Jedediah, riding at the head of the herd, shot a final resentful glance at Ilara before turning his attention to the cattle. His anger at her had not subsided. If anything, it had grown into a cold, hard resentment. He saw her as an interloper, a meddling child who had humiliated him in front of his crew. Sam, riding a few yards behind him, was a quiet figure of authority. He knew the drive would be tough. The dust, the heat, and the thirst of the animals would test their endurance. He had complete faith in the shortcut Ilara had shown him, but a part of him still held a nagging doubt. A single, unseen danger could ruin everything. The hours passed in a slow, agonizing crawl. The sun climbed higher, beating down on the land with an unmerciful intensity. The cattle, their heads low, moved with a sluggish reluctance. The men, their faces caked in dust and sweat, cursed under their breath. The air shimmered with heat, the horizon a blurry mirage. By midday, they were approaching the canyon. The herd was already showing signs of distress. A few of the weaker calves had stumbled and fallen, their exhausted bodies unable to keep up. Jedediah rode up to Sam, his face grim. "They can't take much more, Sam," he said, his voice hoarse. "We need to water them now." Sam nodded. "We're almost there, just through the canyon." Jedediah looked at the narrow opening in the rocks. "You expect to get a herd of 1,000 cattle through that? It's a fool's errand." Sam didn't answer. He just pointed a silent finger towards the crevice. The men dismounted, and Sam led the way on foot, a rifle in his hand, a silent command in his eyes. The ranch hands, though skeptical, followed his lead. They maneuvered the lead cattle into the canyon, a slow, painstaking process. The narrow passage was a tight squeeze, the animals bumping against the stone walls, their hooves scrambling for purchase on the rocky floor. After a long hour, they were all through. The ranch hands looked at the small pool of water, a single source of life in a barren land, and let out a collective sigh of relief. The cattle, sensing the water, pushed forward, their frantic mooing filling the canyon. The men worked quickly, herding the animals to the water, giving them just enough to quench their thirst without overdoing it. Jedediah stood off to the side, his face a storm of conflicting emotions. He was relieved, but also humbled. The girl had been right. Her shortcut had saved them precious time and energy. It was a blow to his pride, a testament to his own short-sightedness. Sam, however, was already thinking ahead. "The creek on the other side is a half-day's ride from here," he said, his voice filled with a new kind of energy. "If we leave now, we can make it by sundown." The men, their spirits lifted by the sight of the water, remounted their horses and began the final leg of the drive. The rest of the journey was difficult, but the knowledge that they were on the right path, that they had a source of water to look forward to, was enough to keep them going. That night, as they set up camp by the banks of the North Creek, the herd sated and resting, Sam found Jedediah sitting by himself, staring into the campfire. Sam sat down beside him, the silence between them thick with unspoken words. "She was right," Jedediah said finally, his voice a low grumble. "The girl. She found a spring where I've been looking for 20 years. She's got a good eye for the land," Sam said simply. "She's a child, Sam," Jedediah said, his voice laced with bitterness. "This isn't right. You're letting her into your life, into this ranch. It's not right." Sam looked at him, his face illuminated by the flickering firelight. "What's not right, Jedediah? A girl and her brothers, starving and alone, or a man with an empty house and a heart full of ghosts?" Jedediah had no answer for that. "I lost a family, Jedediah," Sam continued, his voice low and heavy, "and I chose to forget what it felt like to have one. These kids, they reminded me, they're not a mistake. They're a new beginning." Jedediah was silent for a long moment, the crackling fire the only sound. He had been with Sam through it all, through the loss of his wife, through the years of silent grief. He knew the pain that had hollowed him out, and he had come to accept it as a permanent fixture of Sam's life. But now he saw a different man, a man who was no longer just surviving, but living. "Still a fool thing to do, bringing them here," Jedediah muttered, but the malice was gone from his voice, replaced by a grudging acceptance. Sam just smiled, a small, weary smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Maybe so, but they're my fools now." When they returned to the ranch 2 days later, the herd was in good shape. The drive had been a success. Ilara and her brothers, who had been waiting anxiously, ran out to greet them. Finn and Leo, their small bodies filled with an exuberant energy, raced to Sam's horse, their laughter ringing out across the plains. Sam dismounted, his face tired but content. He knelt down and hugged the two boys, a rare display of affection. He looked up at Ilara, who was watching him with a wide, grateful smile. He saw in her eyes a quiet understanding, a shared sense of accomplishment. They had faced a drought and a long, difficult drive, and they had won. Not just because of a shortcut, but because they had faced it together. The ranch was now more than just a piece of land. It was a testament to survival, resilience, and the fragile, beautiful power of an unlikely family. The successful cattle drive was a turning point. The ranch, now secure against the immediate threat of the drought, began to thrive in a way it hadn't in years. The long, dry spell broke, and the land was blessed with a much-needed rain. The grass grew tall and green, the creeks swelled, and the cattle, fat and healthy, were a testament to Sam's leadership and Ilara's keen eye. The change was most noticeable in the dynamics of the ranch itself. Jedediah, though he would never admit it, had a grudging respect for Ilara. He still grumbled, still held on to his bitterness, but he no longer interfered with her or her brothers. He had seen firsthand that she was not a burden, but a valuable part of the ranch. The other ranch hands, too, now treated them as equals, and even sought Ilara's advice on occasion, asking her about the best places to find certain plants or which shortcuts were best for a day's ride. Life for Ilara and her brothers settled into a comfortable rhythm. Finn, who had a natural talent for all things mechanical, spent his days in the barn with Sam, learning to repair saddles and wagons. Leo, the youngest, was in his own little world, a world of chickens, tadpoles, and imaginary adventures. He was a constant source of joy, his innocent laughter a balm to the soul. Ilara's days were still filled with work, but now she had a new purpose. She was no longer just surviving, she was building a life. She continued to cook and clean, but she also spent time with Sam, learning about the land, about the cattle, about the intricacies of running a ranch. Sam, in turn, opened up more and more, sharing stories of his youth, of the dreams he had once had for his life. One evening, as the sun was setting, casting a warm glow over the ranch, Ilara and Sam sat on the porch, a comfortable silence stretching between them. Finn and Leo were asleep inside, their gentle snores a soft rhythm in the quiet house. "You've changed this place, Ilara," Sam said, his voice a low, quiet rumble. She looked at him, surprised. I just work." He shook his head. "It's more than that. This ranch, it was a good place, but it was empty. You filled it. You filled it with life." Ilara's heart swelled with a mixture of pride and emotion. She had come here a scared, starving girl begging for scraps. Now she was a part of this place, a part of this family. "What will we do?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. "In the future, when my brothers and I are older?" Sam looked at her, his eyes serious. "What do you want to do?" "I don't know," she said, her brow furrowed. "I just want to be sure my brothers have a good life. A safe life." "You've already given them that," he said. "You've fought for them, and you'll keep fighting for them. That's all a family can do." He looked out at the land, at the moon rising over the vast, empty plains. "This ranch is big enough for all of us. There's room here for more than just me. I'm an old man, Ilara. One day, this will be all yours. You and your brothers." Ilara's breath hitched. She looked at him, her eyes wide with disbelief. "You mean—" He nodded. "I've been thinking about it. You're a part of this ranch now, a part of this family. There's no turning back." His words, simple and direct, were a profound gift. It was a promise of a future, a home, a life that she had never dared to dream of. It was a testament to his trust, to his belief in her, to the fragile, beautiful bond they had forged. A few nights later, Sam came to her with a large box. Ilara, Finn, and Leo gathered around him, their eyes wide with curiosity. He opened the box to reveal a collection of books, their covers worn and their pages yellowed. There were stories of adventure, of far-off lands, and a few books on mathematics and history. It was the books he had promised her, but it was so much more. It was a promise of a life beyond the ranch, a promise of an education, a chance for a future she could choose for herself. Ilara's eyes filled with tears, a mix of gratitude and overwhelming emotion. She looked at Sam, her heart full. He had taken in a starving girl and her brothers, and he had given them a home. He had broken through his own grief and loneliness to build a new family. He had thawed his heart and had, in the process, given them a second chance at life. As she held the books in her hands, she knew that their journey was not over. There would be more challenges, more growing pains, but they were no longer alone. They had each other, and they had a home, a fragile but beautiful promise of a tomorrow that was now full of hope. The setting sun cast long shadows over the land, but in the heart of the Hayes Ranch, a new kind of light was dawning, a light of family, resilience, and the quiet power of a promise kept. The peace at the Hayes Ranch was as fragile as the calm before a storm. The thriving herd and the newfound family bond had brought a sense of security, but the wider world of the Arizona Territory was still a harsh and unpredictable place. As the seasons turned, a new threat began to emerge, not from nature, but from man. Whispers of a notorious cattle-rustling gang, led by a ruthless man named Silas, the Serpent Thorn, began to reach the ranch. Thorn was a shadow in the West, a man who moved with a silent, deadly efficiency. He was known for his cruelty and his ability to vanish into the vast plains. His gang was a well-oiled machine, striking in the dead of night and leaving behind only empty corrals and a trail of fear. His last few raids had been on ranches north of them, and Jedediah, ever the harbinger of bad news, was convinced they were next. "He's moving south," Jedediah said one evening, his face a grim mask. "He'll hit us, Sam. We've got the biggest herd in the county. We're a target." Sam, though concerned, was not prone to panic. "We'll be ready for them. We'll double the night watch. We'll ride patrol. We'll show him we're not an easy mark." Ilara, who had heard their conversation from the kitchen, felt a cold dread settle in her stomach. She had spent so long fighting for a safe life for her brothers, and now a new, unseen danger was threatening to take it all away. She thought of Leo and Finn, their small faces lit up with the joy of their new life, and a fierce, protective instinct rose in her. That night, she couldn't sleep. She walked out to the porch, the air cool and crisp against her skin. She found Sam sitting in his armchair, a rifle across his lap, his eyes fixed on the moonlit horizon. He was a silent sentinel, a man who had built a kingdom and would die to defend it. "You're worried," she said, her voice a whisper in the quiet night. He didn't turn. "There's no sense in not being." "Will they come?" she asked, a knot of fear in her throat. "Maybe," he said, his voice flat. "But if they do, we'll be ready for them." He saw her fear, the small tremors in her hands. He reached out and with a calloused finger touched her hand. "Don't you worry, Ilara. We'll protect this ranch. We'll protect all of you." His words were a promise, a rock of stability in a world of uncertainty. But Ilara knew promises could be broken, and she knew the world was a cruel and unforgiving place. She saw the worry in his eyes, the deep-seated concern that he was not showing the others. He was a man fighting to keep the last good thing in his life from being stolen from him. The next few days were a blur of preparation. The men worked with a new urgency, their faces grim. They mended fences, secured the cattle in the corrals, and stockpiled provisions. Sam taught Ilara how to load a rifle and how to shoot. She was a quick study, her hands steady and her aim true. He was surprised by her natural aptitude, but she told him that when you're hungry, you learn to be a good shot. One afternoon, Jedediah found her practicing her aim on a tin can. He stood there for a long moment, a look of surprise on his face. He said nothing, but the silent respect in his eyes was a greater compliment than any words. He knew she was a fighter, a survivor. The day came when the scouts returned with news. Thorn's gang had been sighted, riding towards their territory. They were a day's ride away, maybe less. The air on the ranch was thick with tension, a heavy silence that was only broken by the nervous neighing of the horses. That evening, as the sun set, casting long, dark shadows, Sam gathered the men in the bunkhouse. He laid out the plan, his voice low and firm. They would set up an ambush. They would lure Thorn's men into a trap, a narrow canyon that led to the north pasture. They would not be taken by surprise. "Jedediah, you'll take the high ground," Sam said, looking at his foreman. "You'll be our eyes. Give us the signal when they're in the kill zone." Jedediah nodded, his face grim but resolute. He was back in his element, a soldier preparing for a war. As the men left, their faces a mixture of fear and determination, Sam found Ilara standing by the door, her hands clenched into fists. "Stay with your brothers," he said, his voice softer now. "Lock the doors. Don't open them for anyone." "Be careful, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice a little choked. He nodded, a small, weary smile on his face. "I will. Now go." She watched him ride away, a solitary figure against the fading light. He was a man who had been alone for so long, and now he was riding into a battle, not for his own survival, but for the survival of the fragile family he had found. She went back inside, her heart heavy, and found her brothers sleeping peacefully. She sat beside them, a rifle in her lap, and watched the silent night, a sentinel in the dark, waiting for the storm to break. The calm was an illusion, a beautiful lie she had come to believe in. But she knew in the deep, cold part of her soul that it was all about to be tested. The night was a vast, inky canvas, punctured only by the cold, distant stars. The Hayes Ranch was a silent, blacked-out fortress, every window shuttered, every door locked. Ilara sat by the fireplace, the rifle a cold weight in her lap, the quiet house a tomb of her fears. She had put out the fire, afraid that the light would draw attention to their location. The only warmth was the silent, steady breathing of her brothers, a small, fragile comfort in the overwhelming darkness. Outside, Sam and his men were a line of silent shadows, waiting in the ambush canyon. The night air was still, heavy with the scent of dust and tension. Jedediah, positioned on a high ridge overlooking the canyon, was a silent silhouette, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was the most experienced tracker and a dead shot. He would not fail. Hours passed, each moment an eternity. The moon was now high in the sky, casting a silver sheen on the land. And then a sound broke the silence, the rhythmic thud of hooves on hard earth. Jedediah raised his hand, a silent signal to the men below. A line of riders, a dark mass against the moonlit plains, was approaching the canyon. They were moving without a fire, without a sound, a silent, efficient force. Thorne's gang, the Serpent and his men. Thorne was a big man, his silhouette broad and imposing even from a distance. He rode at the head of the group, a predatory air about him. He was known for his cunning, his ability to sense a trap. But tonight he was overconfident. He saw an easy mark, a large herd ripe for the taking. The gang rode into the canyon, their movements fluid and practiced. They were now in the kill zone, the high walls of the canyon, a trap. Jedediah watched, his finger on the trigger, waiting for the signal from Sam. But the signal never came. Thorne, with an animal's instinct, suddenly pulled his horse to a stop. He looked up, his eyes scanning the shadows. He saw nothing, but he felt something. A tremor of unease. He had a sixth sense for danger, a gut feeling that had saved his life more than once. "Hold up," he commanded, his voice a low growl. "Something ain't right." The men behind him pulled their horses to a halt. They were all silent, their senses heightened. The silence was an ominous thing, a warning. Sam, below in the canyon, knew his chance was slipping away. He had to act now. He gave a silent nod to his men. A shot rang out, a sharp, deafening sound that shattered the quiet night. The sound was not from one of his men, it was from Jedediah. Jedediah, his finger on the trigger, had not been able to wait any longer. He saw one of Thorne's men, a young boy on a horse, and he saw the fear in the boy's eyes. He had a moment of doubt, a moment of compassion, and he fired a warning shot into the air. The shot was a fatal mistake. Thorne's men scattered, a frantic, disorganized retreat. Thorne himself, his eyes now narrowed with a cold rage, looked up at Jedediah. He saw the flash of the rifle, the dark shape on the ridge. He knew where the shot had come from. He gave a sharp command, and his men, a disciplined force, rode hard out of the canyon, not towards the ranch, but towards the ridge. Sam and his men, their ambush ruined, rode after them, a sense of grim defeat settling in. The ambush was a failure. Thorn was gone, but he was not forgotten. He had been warned. Back at the ranch, Ilara, her heart pounding, heard the shots. She jumped to her feet, her hands trembling. She looked out the window, her eyes straining against the darkness. She saw nothing but shadows. She sat back down, the rifle a familiar weight in her hands. She knew the shots meant something had gone wrong. But what? She could only wait. Hours later, as the first light of dawn was a faint line on the horizon, Sam rode back, his face grim. The men were a silent, defeated line behind him. Jedediah was not with them. Ilara met him at the door, her heart in her throat. "What happened?" she asked, her voice a small, terrified whisper. Sam shook his head. "The ambush was compromised. Jedediah, he fired a warning shot. He gave us away." "What? What about him?" she asked, her eyes wide with a terrible premonition. "They got him," Sam said, his voice flat with a cold, impotent rage. "Thorn's men, they found him on the ridge. We tried to get to him, but we were too late." Ilara's world tilted on its axis. Jedediah, the man who had hated her, who had treated her with such contempt, the man who had fought with Sam, who had tried to run her off, the man who had in the end fired a warning shot and saved their lives. The irony was a bitter pill. He had hated her, but he had in his own way protected her. His life and the life of his friend had been sacrificed to give her a chance at life. Sam walked past her, his head down, his shoulders slumped. The defeat was a physical thing, a weight on his soul. He had lost his oldest friend, and the man who had done it was still out there. Ilara looked out at the breaking day, the beautiful sunrise, a mockery of the darkness in her heart. She thought of Jedediah, his hard face, his cruel words. But she also thought of the silent respect he had shown her, the small moments when he had seen her strength. He had been a part of this family in a strange, twisted way. He had been a part of their story, and now he was gone. She walked to the bunkhouse and found the ranch hands, their faces drawn and pale, huddled together in silence. They were a family of their own, and they had just lost one of their own. They looked at her, and she saw in their eyes a shared sorrow, a shared fear. The shadow of the serpent was not just a threat anymore, it was a reality. He had struck, and he had taken one of their own. He had given them a warning, a taste of his power, and he would be back. The days following Jedediah's death were a grim blur of silence and sorrow. The laughter of Finn and Leo was gone, replaced by a quiet, subdued energy. The ranch hands moved with a heavy, listless rhythm, their eyes downcast. The A foreman's death was a blow to the ranch, a physical and spiritual wound that would take time to heal. Sam was a changed man. The quiet optimism that had begun to bloom in him had been replaced by a cold, hard resolve. His face, once softened by the presence of the children, was now a mask of grim determination. He spent his days on horseback, riding the vast plains, his rifle in his hands, his eyes scanning the horizon. He was a man possessed, driven by a singular, consuming need for revenge. One afternoon, Ilara found him at Jedediah's grave. It was a simple affair, a wooden cross with his name carved into it. He stood there, his back to her, a statue of grief. She walked up to him, her heart aching for him. "You have to stop, Mr. Hayes," she said, her voice soft but firm. "You have to stop." He didn't turn. "He was my friend, Ilara, my brother." "I know," she said, her voice full of empathy. "But if you go after him, you'll be putting the ranch in danger. And us. You have to think of us." He turned then, and his eyes, cold and hard, were a shock to her. "I am thinking of you. If I don't stop Thorn, he'll be back. And when he comes back, he won't be taking one of us. He'll be taking all of us." His words, brutal and honest, were a cold splash of reality. He was right. She knew he was right. Thorn was a snake, and you had to cut off the head to kill it, but she also knew that if he went after Thorn, he would be walking into a trap. Thorn was a master of the hunt, and he would not be outsmarted. "Then we go with you," she said, her voice unwavering. "We'll help you." He looked at her, a flicker of surprise in his eyes. "You're children, Ilara. This is not a game." "We're survivors," she said, her chin raised in defiance. "We've been in a fight for a long time. You don't think we can fight for our home?" He was silent for a long moment, looking at her, at the fierce determination in her face. He saw not a child, but a partner, a soldier. He saw in her eyes a reflection of his own pain, his own rage. He knew she was right. They had to fight together. He finally nodded, a small, weary gesture. "All right, we'll do it together, but we'll do it smart." He went back to the house, and he began to lay out a new plan. This time, there would be no ambush, no open confrontation. This time, they would use cunning, not force. They would hit Thorn where he was weakest, his reputation. They would get the word out, through every small town and homestead in the territory, that Thorn was no longer an invincible force. They would spread the rumor that he had been wounded in the last fight, that his men were turning on him. They would turn his reputation against him. Ilara listened, her eyes wide with awe. This was not the man she had come to know. This was a different man, a man of cold, calculated fury. He was using his mind, not his fists, to fight this battle. The next day, Sam rode out, taking 2 of the most trusted ranch hands with him. They rode to the nearest town, and from there they began to spread the word. They left notes in saloons, talked to travelers, and spread rumors among the local lawmen. The message was simple. Thorn was weak. He was vulnerable. As the days turned into weeks, the rumors began to spread like wildfire. The story of Jedediah's death was twisted and turned, becoming a legend. Thorn, the invincible serpent, was now just a man, a wounded animal waiting to be finished off. But Thorn was not a fool. He heard the rumors, and he knew they were not true. He also knew who was behind them. The Hayes Ranch. The ranch he had tried to raid, the ranch that had defied him. His rage, a cold, silent fire, was now a roaring inferno. He would not be humiliated. He would not be defeated. He would ride back to that ranch, and he would burn it to the ground. One afternoon, Sam returned from his long ride. He was exhausted, but his eyes were filled with a grim satisfaction. "He's coming," he said to Ilara. "The rumors worked. He's coming to finish this. He's not going to try to steal the cattle. He's going to burn us out." Ilara's heart pounded. This was it, the final confrontation. "What do we do?" she asked, her voice a little shaky. "We'll be ready for him," Sam said, a cold, dangerous glint in his eyes. "We'll be waiting." He looked at her, at the fear in her face, and his voice softened. "Don't you worry, Ilara. I won't let him touch you. I swear it." His words were a vow, a promise he had no intention of breaking. He had lost his family once, and he would not lose them again. This was not just a fight for a ranch. It was a fight for a family, a fight for a future. It was a battle for his soul, and he would not rest until the serpent was dead. The scent of dry wood and stale dust hung heavy in the air. The Hayes Ranch was a silent, armed camp. The cattle had been moved to the remote north pasture. The men were positioned in defensive locations around the property, and Sam, rifle in hand, stood on the porch, his eyes fixed on the horizon. The ranch was now a fortress, a monument to defiance. Ilara had taken on a new role. She was the one who kept the men fed and watered, moving with a silent efficiency, her face grim but resolute. She had traded her apron for a gun belt, her ladle for a pistol. She was no longer a child. She was a soldier. Thorn's men arrived just after dusk, a dark mass of shadows against the setting sun. They moved with a chilling silence, their movements practiced and deliberate. They were not here to steal cattle. They were here to destroy. The first sound was the crackle of fire, the flames licking at the dry grass on the perimeter of the ranch. Thorn's men were lighting fires, a ring of destruction that was slowly tightening around the ranch. The air filled with the acrid smell of smoke. Sam, his face grim, gave a silent command, and the men opened fire. The quiet night was shattered by the crack of rifles, the shouts of men, and the angry shouts of Thorn's gang. The battle had begun. Ilara, from her position in the main house, watched the chaos unfold. She saw the flashes of gunfire, the dark figures moving in the shadows. Her hands were shaking, but she held the rifle steady. She was ready. The fight was a brutal, chaotic dance. Thorn's men, a disciplined force, returned fire with a chilling precision. They were not just raiders. They were killers. They were here to make a statement. Suddenly, a group of riders broke away from the main group and rode straight for the main house. They were Thorn's elite, his most trusted men. Their goal was clear: get to Sam. Sam, who had been fighting on the front lines, saw them coming. He knew this was the moment of truth. He yelled a command to his men, and then, with a cold fury, he ran towards the house, his rifle a blur in his hands. Thorn was with them, his face a mask of cold fury. He was a large man, a predator in the night, his eyes fixed on Sam. He had been humiliated once, and he would not be humiliated again. Sam reached the house, and Ilara, seeing the riders approaching, yelled to him, "Mr. Hayes, get inside. Let me shoot." He shook his head. "No, Ilara, it's too dangerous. Stay inside." He was a man who had lost too much, and he would not risk losing another soul he cared for. He would fight this battle alone, but Ilara was not about to be a spectator. She raised her rifle, and with a precision born of desperation, she shot at the lead rider. The shot was a clean one, hitting him in the shoulder and sending him sprawling. Thorn, seeing the girl, the child, firing at his men, let out a roar of rage. He rode towards the porch, his eyes now fixed on her, his target now a personal one. Ilara reloaded, her hands shaking, her heart a frantic rhythm. She looked at Thorn, at the raw, untamed hatred in his eyes, and she knew he was not a man. He was a monster. Sam, seeing the danger, ran toward the porch. He was too late. Thorn dismounted, and with a swift, brutal movement, he grabbed Ilara. He pulled her out of the house, holding her as a shield, a cruel smile on his face. "Drop your weapon, Hayes," he bellowed, "or the girl dies." Sam froze, his rifle aimed at Thorn's heart. He was a man with a choice, his vengeance or her life. He looked at Ilara, her face pale with terror, and the choice was not a choice at all. He slowly, deliberately lowered his rifle. Thorn laughed, a cold, triumphant sound. "A man will always choose a life over a reputation. You're a fool, Hayes." He raised his own gun and aimed it at Ilara's head. He had no intention of letting her go. He was going to make Sam watch. He was going to take everything from him. But Thorn had underestimated one thing. He had underestimated the heart of a boy who had been starving and alone for too long. He had underestimated the heart of a little girl who had lost everything and was willing to die for her family. Finn, who had been watching from the window, saw what was happening. He grabbed a heavy shovel, and with a strength born of desperation, he ran out the door. He swung the shovel with all his might, hitting Thorn in the back of the head. Thorn, stunned, released Ilara, and he crumpled to the ground, his gun clattering to the dirt. He was a man, a powerful, ruthless man, but he was a man who had not accounted for the quiet courage of a child. Sam, seeing his chance, lunged forward. He was on Thorn in a second, his hands wrapped around his throat. He was a man consumed by rage, by a grief that had been building for 20 years. He was a man who had lost a friend, and he would not rest until he had his revenge. Ilara watched, her heart pounding, as Sam fought, his face a mask of cold fury. She knew in that moment that he was fighting for more than just a ranch. He was fighting for his soul. He was fighting for her, for Finn, for Leo, for a future that was no longer an illusion, but a reality. The battle raged around them, the shouts of men, the crack of gunfire, the silent fury of a man who had finally found a reason to live. The battle ended as quickly as it had begun. Thorne's men, seeing their leader fall, broke and scattered, riding off into the night like frightened coyotes. The air was thick with smoke. The ranch was littered with the bodies of men and the silent proof of a brutal fight. Sam, his hands trembling, sat on the ground, his back against the porch, his head in his hands. He was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. He had fought the devil and he had won, but the victory felt hollow. He had lost a friend, and he had almost lost the one thing he had left to lose. Ilara knelt down beside him, her face pale, her hands still shaking. She looked at the bodies of Thorne and his men, and she felt a wave of relief wash over her. They were gone. The threat was gone. She looked at Finn, who was standing there, a small, weary soldier, his face smudged with dirt and soot, the shovel still clutched in his hand. "You saved us, Finn," she whispered, her voice a little choked. He just shrugged, his eyes wide with the shock of what he had done. "I couldn't let him hurt you." Sam looked up, his eyes meeting Finn's, and he saw not a child, but a hero. He had protected his family, a small act of bravery that had saved them all. Sam reached out and with a trembling hand touched Finn's shoulder. "You did good, son," he said, his voice raw with emotion. "You did good." He looked at Ilara, at the silent courage in her eyes, and he felt a profound sense of gratitude. They had fought for him, for the ranch, for the family they had built. They had given him a reason to live, a reason to fight. The next few days were a blur of work. The ranch hands, a weary but victorious lot, buried the dead and began to rebuild. The fires had damaged a few of the outer buildings, but the main house was safe. The ranch would survive. The story of the siege spread like wildfire throughout the territory. The legend of the Hayes Ranch, a ranch that had defied a man like Thorne, grew with every retelling. Sam was no longer just a rancher. He was a hero, but to him, the greatest victory was the quiet peace that returned to the ranch. The laughter of Finn and Leo returned, their small faces bright with the joy of a life that was now safe and secure. Ilara went back to her work, but there was a new confidence in her movements, a quiet pride in her eyes. She had faced the monster, and she had won. One afternoon, Sam found her sitting on the porch, a book in her lap, reading to her brothers. He sat down beside her, a cup of coffee in his hands, and just listened. The silence between them was no longer a symbol of his isolation, but a sign of their connection. "I'm going to go to town next week," he said, his voice a low, quiet rumble. Ilara looked up, her brow furrowed. "Why?" "I'm going to go see the lawyer," he said, looking at her, his eyes filled with a new kind of love. "I'm going to start the paperwork to adopt you all. I want to make it official." Ilara's breath hitched. A tear, a single perfect tear, escaped her eye and traced a clean line down her cheek. She was no longer a stray. She was a daughter. They were no longer a family of circumstance. They were a family of choice. "We're your family, Mr. Hayes," she whispered, her voice a little choked. He shook his head. "You're more than that, Ilara. You're my family, my future." He looked out at the land, at the setting sun, at the promise of a new day. He had lost so much in his life, but he had found something more precious than anything he had ever had before. He had found a family, a reason to live, a reason to be a man again. The world was still a harsh and unforgiving place, but he was no longer alone in it. He was a man with a family to protect, a ranch to run, and a future to build, and he was ready for all of it. The formal adoption was a quiet affair, held in the dusty office of a local lawyer. Ilara, Finn, and Leo, dressed in their best clothes, stood beside Sam, their faces solemn but filled with a quiet joy. The old world was gone, and a new one was just beginning. They were no longer the lost children. They were the Hayes family. The months that followed were a time of growth and change. The ranch, now secure, thrived. The cattle were healthy, the men were loyal, and the Hayes family was a beacon of hope in a land that was still finding its way. Ilara, now with the full support of Sam, began to learn the business of the ranch. She spent her days in the office, learning to read and write, to keep the books, to manage the finances. She had a keen mind and a natural aptitude for business. She was a quick study, and Sam was a patient and proud teacher. Finn, too, found his calling. He was a natural with machines, and he spent his days in the workshop, learning to repair everything from wagons to windmills. He had a bright future ahead of him, a future he had never dared to dream of. Leo, the youngest, was the heart of the family. He was a constant source of laughter and joy, his innocent spirit a balm to the old wounds of his adopted father and his older siblings. He was a boy who had been given a second chance, and he was taking full advantage of it. One evening, as the sun was setting, Ilara and Sam sat on the porch, watching the boys play in the yard. The ranch was a picture of peace and tranquility, the sounds of happy children and contented animals filling the air. "Do you ever think about them?" Ilara asked, her voice soft. "Your wife, your child." Sam looked at her, and his eyes, once so filled with sorrow, were now filled with a quiet peace. "Every day," he said, "but it's not the same. Before it was a pain. Now it's a memory, a part of my story, a part of our story." He looked at her, at the beautiful young woman she had become, at the fierce, protective spirit that still burned brightly in her eyes. "They would have loved you, Ilara, all of you." Tears, hot and salty, filled her eyes. She had come here with nothing but a desperate plea and 2 hungry brothers. She had found a home, a family, and a future. She had found a man who had opened his heart and his home to her, a man who had, in the process, found a new life for himself. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice a little choked, "for everything." He just smiled, a genuine, heartfelt smile that reached his eyes. "You don't have to thank me, Ilara. You gave me more than I could ever give you. You gave me a reason to live." He stood up and, with a gentle hand, pulled her to her feet. He looked out at the vast, endless horizon, at the setting sun, at the promise of a new day. He had faced down the devil, he had fought a brutal war, he had buried a friend. But he had won. He had won the greatest prize of all, a family, a future, a new horizon. The story of the Hayes Ranch, the story of a starving girl and her brothers, the story of a lonely rancher and his empty heart, was not just a story of survival. It was a story of hope. It was a story of a family that had been found, a heart that had been thawed, and a new horizon that was full of the promise of a tomorrow that was now finally theirs.